Redditor Slutty McCum Dumpster shared their strange incident that occurred at their house, which was built on what was once an open prairie where Native American artifacts have been found lying around. They moved there as a teenager with their mother after their parents divorced. At first, it seemed great when the house was spacious and comfortable, but the strange occurrences became more and more frequent. They often heard footsteps downstairs brushing their teeth in the evening, and although they thought it was their mother, there was never anyone there when they checked. Strange footsteps became a very common sound in the house, especially at night. They finally accepted the house was haunted. One day they and one of their good friends had just came out from sunbathing and decided to go to their house because their mother was on a business trip, so they thought they would have the house to themselves. They entered and went straight to the basement, which was cooler than the rest of the house. The witness noticed that the yellow submarine poster hanging at the bottom of the stairs was tilted slightly to the left. Ignoring it at the time, they fixed it and entered the main room of the basement. There were pictures and posters hanging all over the basement, so the witness and their friend were instantly spooked to see them all leaning to the left. However, the absurdity of the situation didn't end when the door of the storage space, which was basically a dirt floored room about 4 feet off the ground, was cracked open. The witness walked by and saw a golden glow emanating out. A light about 10 feet from the door of the storage space was turned on. They crawled on their hands and knees into the storage space to turn off the light. They then called their mother, hoping there was a natural explanation for everything, but it turned out she wasn't in the basement since weeks before she had left her for her trip. They looked back to the storage room to see a footprint in the dirt. The footprint was the most distorted and mangled footprint they had ever seen. And the witness froze. The friend had the same reaction, with the two looking at each other wordlessly with a sickening, gut-wrenching feeling. They closed the storage door. They both ran out of the house as fast as they could. The witness will never forget that footprint, and the thought that they crawled into that storage space to turn off the light still gives them chills. Writing on his paranormal website in 1994, Brian Bethel recounted a strange and terrifying experience he had when he was only about 4 or 5 years old. He was staying at his grandparents' house with his mother because his father was out of town for a short work trip. His grandparents really enjoyed the wonders of modern television, and Brian had just eaten one of his grandmother's home-cooked meals. Soon the whole family piled into the king-size bed in the grandparents' room and fell asleep. Brian woke up suddenly that night and looked around the room. It didn't seem to be a problem before the TV turned itself on. This was around 1977, before TV remotes were a widely used commodity, so it was quite unusual to see the TV turn itself on. Confused, Brian sat up and looked at the screen. The TV in the room was black and white, so Brian watched as the small dot in the center of the screen expanded to cover the entire screen. Nothing seemed to be there, it was just static. But as he continued watching, shadowy things began to appear. They were blurry figures and they seemed to be looking at him. He said they were scoping him out. Finally, a clearer picture slowly emerged, the googly eyes and woolen fur of familiar puppets. The Muppets appeared, and Brian was excited to see them, trying to wake up his grandparents to show them. There were two of these Muppet-like figures, one looking vaguely like Grover, and the other reminiscent of Harry the Monster. However, upon closer inspection, he began to feel a little uncomfortable with the strange sight on the screen. The Muppets had teeth. Those teeth looked alarmingly real and out of place in an otherwise standard Muppet-style mouth. There were rows and rows of those strange teeth. When Brian didn't know what to do next, he continued to watch the TV. The Muppets looked at Brian, which was not unusual for the puppets from this type of TV show, sometimes known to acknowledge the audience. The Grover-esque Muppets leaned over to the hairy creature and apparently pointed at Brian while whispering something to him. It had very long, distinct claws on its hands, which Brian found very disturbing. After Grover pointed at him, both Muppets turned to look at him in unison and whispered in a strange, unusual guttural language. This seemed completely random, but Brian specified that followed the meter and pattern of a language. After that, the creatures began to dance, sing, and spin, chatting in their strange language. Brian thought it was amusing and felt a little more relaxed. However, that feeling quickly disappeared when the Muppets invited him to perform. He shook his head, but they persisted. The Muppets started to become visibly angry, and with all those teeth, this was not pretty. Despite the grotesque mayhem, Brian's grandparents did not wake up to the noise, which further disturbed the child. Jumping out of bed and sneaking into the living room, being very careful not to get too close to the terrifyingly active screen, the Muppets were now visions of absolute rage and frantically beckoned Brian to come closer. He had desperately tried to wake his grandparents, but they didn't answer at all. In utter desperation, he ran into the living room and collapsed on his grandfather's chair before crying in complete panic. Only, of course, there was also a television in the corner of this room. It had already begun, and the shadowy figures of the horrifying Muppets were already beginning to form in the static. Brian was paralyzed with fear and let out an extremely loud, desperate scream. Just as the sobs left his lungs, the toothy faces of the Muppet monsters came onto the screen. However, Brian began to hear footsteps. They got louder and louder, and the Muppets looked worried before dimming back into their shadow forms and disappearing completely. The TV turned itself off as Brian's mother entered the room. His mother took a moment to comfort the hysterical child, and then they both went to check on the grandparents. The grandparents were awake and heard Brian screaming. All four stayed awake for a while, talking to each other until Brian was calm enough to go back to sleep. Nothing else happened that night or ever again. Brian claims he was awake during the incident. He was able to get out of bed and run into the living room, and his mother confirmed that she found him in the living room that night. He believes the creatures on the TV screen that night took Muppet form to lure him closer. He thinks that the teeth and claws were probably part of their true form that they had not yet learned to hide. To this day, he wonders what would have happened if he approached the screen the way the Muppets insisted. What better way to capture a young lad than to show him something he loves and suddenly pull him in? It was a clear day in the summer of 1980, and 12-year-old Chris and his cousin Eric, who was about the same age, decided to go trout fishing in a nearby stream. Chris lived on Caraman Road in Ashford, Washington, and his cousin lived across from him. They hiked about 2 miles into the woods and were getting ready to set up their fishing gear when Chris noticed what he thought was a bear. It sat on the other side of the stream, only 40 feet from the children, sitting with its back to them while rubbing its back against a stump. Chris said, "Hey, look at the bear," causing the bear, which wasn't really a bear, to stand up and turn to look directly at the boys. The hairy humanoid was described as 6 to 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide at the shoulders. It was covered in well-groomed brown hair all over except for the face, which had shorter blonde hair instead. His head was round and crowned with a light, shaggy mane like a lion's, and his face was flat with a human nose and eyes. Chris remembered not seeing the creature's mouth, possibly because of its fur. He didn't notice any muscles or genitalia on the creature, suggesting it must have had a very slim physique. The arms were human-like and not unusually long, although it definitely had hands. Chris couldn't remember if it had claws. The kids had a very brief scuffle with the monster that only lasted 10 to 15 seconds before they both dropped their fishing equipment and ran back through the woods. They never went back to get their supplies, presumably out of hysterical fear. Chris encountered 2 other similar creatures when he was 18. He was camping with his girlfriend, and they both saw a large furry silhouette walking between the side of the tent and the fire. As it did, it ran his finger along the top of the tent. Understandably startled by the animal's strange behavior, the young couple retreated from their campsite soon after. When he was 27 years old, he and his friends were hiking in the woods when they found a shelter made with timber and a pine needle floor. They stood for a while in the shelter, but they soon got an uneasy feeling and were compelled to leave immediately. They did not encounter any creatures that day. Barry and Elaine had just attended a Christmas party in the Staffordshire town of Penkridge and were on their way back to their home in Sitting Mill. The year was 1975, and the Staffordshire couple were in their 20s. Their 2 small children were in the back of the car as they drove along the lonely country roads on the cold winter morning. When they reached their small home village, the car's engine suddenly sputtered before they came to a complete stop. Concerned, Barry got out of the vehicle to find out what was wrong. Barry just managed to coast the car to the side of the road near an old stone house on the edge of Sitting Mill. Using the last momentum of the vehicle, suddenly became useless and had gotten out to open the hood of the vehicle and check the engine. He was basically useless in mechanical matters. However, he was not so useless that he could see that there were clearly no loose wires and were no problems with the vehicle's fuses. And the radiator did not overheat, which is more than I know about cars. The car seemed to just stop for no reason, considering that it might be a while to get the car started again, and realizing that they were roughly less than half a mile from their house. Barry decided that the best course of action would be to take out the picnic blanket they had in the trunk of their car and give it to Elaine so she could keep herself and their children warm, while he ran home to get Elaine's car to drive his family home. The children were asleep at this point, seeing as it was in the small hours of the morning, and they were only 4 and 6 years old at the time of the incident. Barry and Elaine planned to have someone from the garage look at the car the next day. Suddenly, Elaine let out a loud scream as she saw the horrifying sight of a small humanoid figure running quickly across the street in front of them. Apparently, she managed to see the creature at the last second before it disappeared from view. Elaine then realized she was seeing a second and third creature following the first creature. Under the light of the moon, the witness could see that the small creatures had hunched backs and hooked noses. They were about 4 feet tall. They wore no clothes. Their bodies were completely covered with hair. After the creatures had all crossed the road, they could be seen wandering along the edge of the trees on the other side of the road, watching out for something like they were wary animals. Then the creatures began slowly approaching the witnesses. They crept forward as if hunting prey. Barry has since thought that maybe the creatures just wanted to know who they were. Elaine was completely inconsolable with panic, and Barry was fast approaching that state as well. Worried about his young children, it was at this point that Barry and Elaine suddenly experienced total amnesia, and the next thing they knew, it was 2 o'clock and the car suddenly restarted. Neither Barry nor Elaine remember seeing the creatures leave the scene, and they would have been left with the nagging feeling that something has happened to them. He couldn't access those hidden memories, but he said he would later dream of the creatures surrounding the car. He is only certain that the creatures were really there and that they were real. The children seem to remember nothing of the incident. They haven't had any further experiences with the unexplained, but this particular incident will haunt them for the rest of their lives.